How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Aleph, Daf 101. We've officially broken through the 100-page. I don't know what exactly it is to break through it, but I don't know exactly. Some psychological milestone. We've broken through it. We've pushed through the other side, and now we are up to Daf Kuf Aleph of Masechta Menachos. How exciting is that? We begin the 12th chapter of Masechta Menachos. Boy, let me tell you, it is a Kodshemi daf, a very technical daf, but it feels to me like a very important daf. A very important daf. It feels like we're going to be learning about important pieces of an important topic. The first subject being podeh Kodesh. Why is that so groundbreaking? It feels like such a huge deal to me. It's one of the things it's one of the kudshim things that it's one of the things that I wonder about in my mind when it comes to kudshim, when it comes to Kodesh. Like, what exactly? I'll throw out a scenario. Can you be, if you are makdish, this is what we're talking about. It's technical stuff. If you're makdish a sheep as a korban shlamim, can you turn around and say, you know what, I want to just be podeh it. I want to just be podeh it, and I'll redeem it onto money. Can you do that? No, you can't do that. But why not? Because after all, it's the shlamim. It doesn't have kedusha. You see, these are technical things I wonder about. You see, if it was a chatas, so chatas, if I understand correctly, from the time that you're makdish it has kedusha saguf. Okay, from the time that you're makdish, it has kedusha saguf, and there's a din me'ila when it comes to chatas is kachim kachim, shlamim is kachim kal. So that would only have there's no din me'ila, just have kedusha dam. So maybe I can be podeh, but you can't be podeh. Why not? So we're going to talk about that. So today, that's kind of what we're talking about today, right? Kedushas damim, being podeh kedushas damim, under what circumstances. So it's part of this bigger picture about hektish, about different kinds of hektish. When can you be podeh? When can you not be podeh? If it gets a mum, until what point? We're going to be discussing a lot of these topics today. So very technical, but it feels like also very important for understanding, for understanding hektish and Kodesh, and it's not going to be the whole picture, but we're going to get some important pieces of an important picture. So I was very excited to learn today's daf for that reason. It felt like there's really important pieces of the puzzle that we're working with today. So that is the first section of today's daf, and then the second section of today's daf, Tumas ochalin for pigul of a mincha according to Reb Shimon. Woo! Now, if that is not specific, anyways, but it is also a somewhat interesting sugya, but it's very, very, very kudshimi. So, woo! Yeah, join me, and we are going to jump. I feel like we haven't had such a kudshimi. Basically all of Zvachim was like 4 months of this, and a lot of Menachos was this too. But it feels like we haven't in the immediate, in the short term past. I don't think we've had such a kudshimi sugya like this. So friends, join me. Let's jump in. Let's enjoy ourselves. Happy Independence Day, Yom HaAtzmaut in Eretz Yisrael. So a very exciting day to be studying Torah in Eretz Yisrael, learning all about korbanos. Looking forward to offering maybe a korban this afternoon. That would be nice. Let us study Daf Kuf Aleph of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we begin on Daf Kuf Amid Beis at the new Perek, at the mission at the new Perek, HaMenachos v'Hanesachim. Okay, meal offerings, flour offerings. V'Hanesachim, libations. That Nesachim usually is reference to minchas Nesachim. I think maybe also the oil that comes with it, Nisuch Hayayin, right, wine libations. Shenitmiu ad shelo kidshu bakli. Okay, so they became kadosh, but they weren't yet. So meaning you had said, okay, I'm going to bring this flour as a mincha, or this wine as a nesachim, and they became tamei ad shelo kidshu b'kli, but they didn't yet become kadosh b'kli. You see, once they go into a kli shares, then they have kedushas aguf. That changes things, but they haven't yet been in a kli shares. So it's not kedushas aguf; it's kedushas damim. It's kedushas damim. kedushas damim. Okay, fine. So it's kedushas damim and it's tameh. So yeshlam pidyon. So you can be podeh. Okay, so we have kedushas damim. Now this is, you see, now here's the thing. You see, this is part of the whole big story stuff. So now, when it comes to kedushas bedek habayis, okay, like for example, if I say I'm going to donate my watch to the Beis Hamikdash, I could just be podeh to the best of my knowledge. I think we'll probably we're going to delve into this more, I think, in Masechta Arachin. But anyways, my understanding is that we could, if I donate my watch to the Beis Hamikdash, I could push it. Well, the temple treasury will evaluate the value of the watch and tell me how much I could redeem it for, and I'll pay them, and I can keep my watch. Now, when it comes to something that goes in the mizbeach, like a flour offering, right, like flour for a flour offering or wine for nisachim, so in that case, so what we're saying, it's going to be a machlokes in the Gemara, but let's just stick to the pshat of the Mishnah. What we're saying is that for this flour, even though it's not yet in a kli shares, okay, once it's in a kli shares, because it's kedushas haguf, that is different, rather than kedushas dam, which is just a monetary kedusha. But so long as it hasn't yet been in a kli shares, so this flour, or this wine, let's talk about flour, this flour is kadosh with kedushas damim. But nonetheless, let's say that because it's fit to go on the mizbeach, that makes it different than my watch, okay? And therefore, because it's fit to go on the mizbeach, the Mishnah is saying shenitmu, right? Shenitmu, so the kedushas damim, they're fit to go on the mizbeach, but they became tameh. So achalo kitchu b'chli, so long as they haven't yet been in a kli shares, so yeshlam pidyon, so you can be podeh them. Misha kitchu b'chli. However, once they are in a kli shares and they are now kadosh with kedushas haguf, ein lem pidyon, you can no longer be podeh them. And as we're going to learn in just a moment, that the only scenario, we're covering so much ground just in the first line and a half of the Mishnah, the only scenario where kedushas haguf can be podeh, where you could redeem kedushas haguf, and then the kedusha is transferred onto the money, and the animal is no longer kadosh. In many cases, there are still restrictions, but anyways, we can be podeh is an animal that gets a mum, right? Of course, right? If I go over to Sar the U and say, I choose you to be a korban chatas, and then Sar the U is so happy that she is going to be a korban for the Rabbanan Shalom, she jumps for joy, lands, and her leg flies off, and she is now missing a leg, and that is a mum, and so you can be podeh Sarah the U, and we will have to offer Rivka the U instead. Now, okay, so therefore, so when he says that I'm going, Sarah the U, I choose you to be a korban chatas, so she's kadosh kedushas haguf. However, if she gets a mum, then you can be podeh. That's the only example where kedushas haguf, you can be podeh. But we're saying that the mincha, though, once it is kadosh b'kli shares, that's kadosh kedushas haguf, you can't be podeh, even if it's tameh, you can't be podeh anymore. And interestingly, even when it comes to an animal, so when it comes to Sarah the U, you can only be podeh Sarah the U when she gets a mum, if she was kadosh b'kli shares. What does kadosh b'kli shares mean? The knife. The knife is a kli shares. So after shchita, so then you can no longer be podeh. There's no longer, right? Once an animal is kadosh kedushas haguf and has been slaughtered, and now not just kadosh kedushas haguf, but also kli shares of the knife. So then there's no option of being podeh that animal anymore. Wow. We have just covered a lot of ground already. We have, even though we barely moved in the Mishnah, but let's even just review already. What have we talked about? We've talked about kedushas bedek habayis. It's just donating something to the Beis Hamikdash. You can be podeh even if it's tahor. Now, something that's fit for the mizbeach. So what we seem to be saying right now is that at least if it has, let's say flour, if it hasn't yet been in a kli shares, so it's kedushas damim, and certainly if it becomes tameh, the Mishnah is saying that you can be podeh. Once it's been kadosh kedushas haguf in a kli shares, well, now you cannot be podeh it. The only because it's kadosh bekedushas haguf. The only scenario where you can be podeh something that's kadosh kedushas haguf is an animal that gets a mum. Then you can be podeh. But even by an animal, if it's been shechted with a knife, and the knife is a klisharis, you can't be podeh it anymore. Wow, we've covered so much just in that line and a half. I'm going to drink some tea. Let's read that again. Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, Haminachos v'anesachim, minchas and nesachim, shenitmu ad shelo kitchu b'kli, that they have not yet been in a klisharis. They are kodesh kedushas domim, and they become tameh. Yesh lem pidyon, so you can be podeh them, you can redeem them, and they will no longer be kadosh. Misha kitchu b'kli, once, however, the flour has been in a klisharis, ein lem pidyon, they now have kedushas haguf, and you can no longer be podeh them. Ha'ofis, birds, va'etzim, we're going to have to explain why in the Gemara, but ha'ofis, boids, va'etzim, wood, holtz, va'levona, frankincense, v'kleishares, and the kleishares themselves, mishenitmu, if they are tameh, ein lohem pidyon, you can't be podeh them, shalonemar pidyon el b'behemoth, that pidyon, as we've been saying, by kedushas haguf, there's all kinds of pidyon by kedushas haguf is only by an animal, as we've been discussing with Sarah the U. The seifa of the Mishnah that we just read with the wood and the ha'ofis va'ezer, it's a little bit, we need more info to be able to understand it, so we're gonna have to wait until the Gemara in order to understand it. Okay, fine. Again, I'm not gonna do a whole review now, but I just want to remind ourselves that we've already learned a lot. Let's keep in mind everything that we've learned. Let's go weiter. We're going to see in the Gemara now that there's a machlokes between Shmuel and Rav Huna bar Manoyach with regard to what if the flour is not yet kadosh b'kedushas, kadosh b'klisharis, so it's kedushas damim, so you have flour, it's kadosh kedushas damim, and so it hasn't yet been in klisharis, but it's tahor. What happens there? The Mishnah had said if it's tameh, you can be podeh. Not yet in the klisharis, kadosh kedushas damim, it's tameh, you can be podeh that. What if it's tahor? Can you be podeh if it's tahor? Great question. It's a great question, right? Meaning you take flour, you designate the flour to be a mincha, and then you change your mind. Can you be podeh that? Can you just say, okay, fine, I'm going to transfer its value onto money. It's kedusha onto money, and now the flour I could eat it for lunch or whatever. Drink more tea. That's a great question. Can you just be podeh that flour? Amar Shmuel says, Shmuel, va'afilu ein toharin. Yes, you can. Even if the flour is tahor, so long as it is not kedushas haguf, it has not yet been in a klisharis, so then, Amar Shmuel, va'afilu ein toharin, even if the flour is pure, is tahor. Niftin, it can be redeemed. My taima, how come? Kamadulo, kachi, b'kleisharis, b'kli. The answer is because so long as the flour has not yet been in a klishares, kedushas damim nenu, it simply has monetary kedusha, and monetary kedusha can be redeemed. The kedushas damim niftin, you can redeem kedushas damim. Ve'ha nitmu tanan. Okay, so the Gemara asks the question that we expect it to ask, which is, after all, the Mishnah does say that we're talking about shenitmu, right? I'm going to read the Mishnah. Menachos v'anesachim shenitmu. So the Mishnah says that you can be podeh if they're tameh. Does that not imply that if they're tahor, you would be unable to be podeh? Only if it becomes tameh and becomes unusable, then you can be podeh. Huadin de'af al gab de lo nitmu. So Shmuel would say, you're right, it does say that, but the fact of the matter is, even if they're tahor, you could still be podeh. The reason why it says tameh is not for the reisha. The reason why it says tameh is for the seifa. That mishakitshu bekli ein lo pidyon. That the Mishnah then said right after that however, once the flour has been in a klisharis and now is kadosh with kedushas haguf, well then, even if it's tameh, it can't be redeemed. As I pointed out, the only time that you can redeem kedushas haguf is by an animal that has a mum. This is not that, and So the Mishnah had said that if the flour becomes kadosh in a kli shares, so then if the flour becomes kadosh in a kli shares, so then it can no longer be redeemed even if it is tamei. Right? Seifa misha, where am I? V'ayzukah boy misna seifa misha kidshu bakli ein len pidyon dafilu nitmu namilo, that in the seifa, even if they became tamei, they still cannot be redeemed once it's been in the kli shares. So Tananami Reisha Shenitmu, so therefore the Reisha also says that they can be podeh, but the fact of the matter is, argues Shmuel, even if they were tahor, you could still be podeh, so long as they have not yet been in the kli shares. They are just kedushas dam, they could be podeh, even if they're tahor. Now, I'm going to read these next few words differently, and I am going to read them Mishakidju bakli ein len pidyon, that the Mishnah had said that once the flour is kadosh in the kli shares, and it's kadosh kedushas haguf, well then you can't be podeh even if it's tamei. Pshita, that's obvious, kedushas haguf ninu. Of course you cannot be podeh. It's kedushas haguf. It's drich. No, I needed the Mishnah to teach me that, because it wouldn't have been so obvious. Why is it not so obvious? Because sagadati chamino, I may have thought to say, oil uval mum ikre tamei. Since, as we're going to see in a few minutes, a bal mum, the Torah refers to a bal mum as tamei. So tamei nami ki bal mum dami. So I'll say that, well, if A equals B, B equals A. If a bal mum is referred to as a tamei, well then maybe I should say that we can also consider tamei to be a bal mum, i.e., let's treat this flour that's been in the kli shares and is now kadosh kedushas guf, but it is tamei. Well, let's treat this flour that's tamei like we would treat an animal that is a mum. And I may have thought about fagav the kadosh kedushas guf, and therefore I could argue that by the flour that has been kadosh in the kli shares, and even though it's kadosh kedushas guf, ki nafil be mum. So this is by the animal. Where am I? So. One second. I'm backing up to the first wide line. So Zakadat Dechamina, Oyuluval Mum Ikre Tome Nami Kival Mum Dami. If Afagav, when it comes to an animal, by the way, this next few lines read a little bit funny. But anyways, Vafagav the Kodesh, when it comes to an animal, Vafagav the Kodesh Kedushas Aguf, Kinafil Be Mum Miparek. So when it comes to an animal, as I've been saying, Sar the U is set aside to be a korban chatas. So the U gets a mum, so you can be podeh, right? So v'afagav, and even though it's kadosh kedushas haguf, right? So v'afagav the kadosh kedushas haguf. I'm reading that again. Even though sar the U is kadosh kedushas haguf, kinafel be mum. When she gets a mum, miparek, she can be redeemed. So let's say this: if tamei equals mum, well, let's say that this ochanami, haninami, the flour as well. Let's say the zel bezach, lifrok. Let us redeem this flour that is kadosh b'kli shares, kadosh kedushas haguf, but it becomes tamei. We should treat it like it as a mum, like the way that we treat a mum in an animal. Kamash malon delav ki ai tamei karye rachmana libal mum. Kamash malon. That 1 second, when the Torah talks about a bal mum, and it refers, as we're going to see in a moment, to a bal mum as a tamei, it isn't referring to tamei like the flour that is kadosh b'kli shares and becomes tamei. No, the mikli shares lo ashkechan to mipark, because we don't find any scenario, even by an animal, where once it's kadosh b'kli shares, that you can be podeh. Even by an animal, by Sarah the U, when she gets a mum and now you can be podeh Sarah the U with the mum, even though she's kadosh kedushas haguf, she hasn't yet been in a kli. There's been no kli sharis interaction. That would only happen in the Beis Hamikdash with the shchita knife. That would be the kli sharis. Until then, you can be podeh her if she gets a mum, not post kli sharis. And therefore, this flour that has been in this kadosh b'kli sharis kedushas haguf, so then because it's already been in the kli sharis, you can't be podeh it, and that would be the same thing for an animal as well. Post kli sharis cannot be podeh. Okay, wow, we have learned quite a bit so far. I'm going to take another shluck of tea. Says the Gemara. Uval mum, eicha ikre tame. Okay, we've just been saying for the last few minutes that a bal mum is referred to as tame. Where is this? Disani we learn in the Brayso. Ve'im kol behema tmeya asher lo yakrivu mimena. What is this? Vayikra chav zayin. So okay, this is in Bichukosai, I believe. So when are we going to learn Parshas Bichukosai? This week is Achrim Kedoshin, and then Emor, and Bar Bichukosai. That's it, right? Last week was Tazir Mitzor. That was a tricky parsha. This week is Achrim Kedoshin, Emor, Bar Bichukosai. So, okay, so in 2 weeks we'll be learning about this in Chumash. The pasuk says, "Ve'im kol behema tmeya." If any behema tmeya, which we're saying means a balmum, asher lo yakriv mimena korban Hashem, you can't offer it as a korban, and instead you are podeh. B'balemumin sheniftin hakozim v'daber. This pasuk, when it talks about ve'im kol behema tmeya here is talking about a balmumd animal. Ataomer b'balemumin sheyipadu eno elo b'behema tmeya mamish. Wait, one second. Why are we saying that this pasuk that talks about a behema tmeya is in fact talking about a balmum? I'll say it's talking about a horse, a behema tmeya, being podeh, a behema tmeya. Because you Omer, I'll tell you why. Because we have another pasuk later on in that chapter, in Perek Chav Zayin of Sefer Vayikra. Ve'im bebehema hatmeya ufada be'arkecha. Hare behema tmeya amura. That pasuk is talking about being podeh a behema tmeya, a horse, a donkey, etc. Homani mekayim ve'im kol behema tmeya. So then, what's the deal with the earlier pasuk that we had quoted that talks about behema tmeis? It's not talking about a non-kosher animal. We have a different pasuk for that. It's talking about an animal with a mum. Bibale mumin sheyipadu hakosu medaber. We are talking about balmums. That balmums you could be podeh. So Sarah the U gets a mum. You could be podeh Sarah the U. Yachol yipadu amum over. What if it, however, is a mum that is temporary? Give it a week of rest. Give it a week of rest, and the mum will be healed. Can you be podeh that animal? Talmud Omar asher lo yakriv mimenu korban Hashem. Only animals that get mums that are unhealable, mums that you will never be able to offer that animal as a korban, those you can be podeh. Misha eina kreva laHashem kol ikr. Only animals that are permanently blemished, animals that will never be able to be offered to their Rebbeinu Shalom, those can be podeh, those can be redeemed. Yatzisa zoi, to the exclusion of a temporary mum, she'eino kreva hayom ukreva l'machar, that while it can't be offered today, it can be offered in tomorrow, in the future, once it's been healed, once it has healed. So those animals cannot be podeh. Okay, so an animal that has a permanent mum can be podeh, not an animal that has a fly-by-night, a temporary mum. Most of Rav Huna bar Manoach. Okay, Rav Huna. So Rav Huna bar Manoach argues with Shmuel. Shmuel had said that when it comes to this flour, pre-kli shares, okay, that's kadosh kedushas damim. Shmuel says even if it's tahor, you can still be podeh. Even if it's tahor, you can be podeh. You set aside flour to be a korban mincha, and you say, you know what, change my mind, I want to be podeh. You can be podeh. It's completely tahor, you can be podeh. Most of Rav Huna bar Manoach, Rav Huna bar Manoach asked a question of ofis, that our Mishnah had said birds, the eitzim, trees, wood, valavona, frankincense, the kleshares, and kleshares themselves, shenitmu, that they became tameh, ein lahem pidyon, you cannot be podeh them. Shlonemer pidyon el bebehema, because we only have pidyon, the concept of pidyon by kedushas haguf for animals that have mums. Now, bishlama ofis kedushas haguf ninu. Okay, so I understand on that list birds. Birds are kadosh with kedushas haguf. Once you say that you are going to offer a bird as a chatas or as an olah. So it is kadosh kedushas ha-guf, and we're saying that even if it becomes tameh, you cannot be podeh because v'lo nemar ela b'beima, because only animals can you be podeh if they get a mum. That does not that is not the case for birds. Birds cannot be podeh. Okay, fine. Ela eitzim v'levona v'klei shares, but what about the rest of the list? The wood, the frankincense. Now we're talking about frankincense that has not yet been kadosh b'kli shares. V'klei shares, as well as klei shares. Liparku. Why don't we say that even though they are tameh, they cannot be poded? How come? Elalav, is it not because, right? So meaning we had said earlier that when it comes to the flour, for example, if it's tameh for sure, right? It hasn't been. It's kedushas damin, and it's tameh. So we said for sure it could be poded. The question was, what about if it's tahor? Now here we're talking about wood, frankincense, klei shares that became tameh, right? What did the Mishnah say? We said they became tameh, and nonetheless ein lem pidyon. So we have to figure out why. So the beima, where am I? So why can't you be podeh them? They're tameh. Why can't you be podeh them? Elav mishum de tahorin ba'alma ein niftin. Well, says Rav Huna bar Manoach, look, in order to understand this, we're going to have to assume that in general, when kedushas damim is tahor and it's fit for the mizbeach, but it's tahor, you cannot be podeh it. So going back on the beginning of the Mishnah, when it says pidyon, that when the Mishnah says that the flour pre-kli shares that is tameh, you can be podeh, it means literally if it's tameh. Unlike Shmuel, literally if it's tameh, you can be podeh. But if it's tahor, you can't be podeh. Now, v'hanei nami, and the reason why you can't be podeh the wood and you can't be podeh the frankincense, you can't be podeh the klei shares, are because in these three cases, even though they're tameh, kit tehorim damu, they are like tehorim, as we're going to explain in a minute, and because they're like their tehorim, they can't be podeh. And that so Rav Huna bar Manoach wants to argue that the only way to explain why the wood, the frankincense, and the klei shares, even though they're tameh, they can't be poded, is because in general tahor items that can go on the mizbeach cannot be poded, and these three items, even though they're tameh, we treat them like tahor eitem that can't be poded. The key being tahor items would not be able to be poded, unlike Shmuel. Skip the next two lines. De eitzim, right? The first one online is de eitzim. De eitzim kama delo mishafelu ligzirin lo miskashre. The reason being for the wood, because so long as they haven't been shaped into their proper shape, right? You know, wood is also shaped, right? Wood that we interact with is cut up into like boards and stuff. So until it's been properly shaped, it would not be makabel tumah. Therefore, it wouldn't actually be tameh, and therefore it's tahor. And we're saying that you can't be podeh tahor stuff. Livona nami kamadulo kitcher bekli sharis lo miskashu. Also, the levona, I don't necessarily understand why, but levona, so long as it has not yet been kadosh bekli sharis, it would be unable to be makabel tumah. We're going to reject this anyways, but okay, and therefore it's also not going to be tameh. It'll be tahor. And the klisharis also, since you could always, the klisharis just dip it in the mikvah and it'll become tahor, so also we're not going to consider it tameh. And therefore, because all of these three items would be considered tahor, you cannot be podeh them. So again, Rav Huna bar Manoach is arguing against Shmuel. Shmuel had said that when it comes to the flour, and remember, it's not yet kadosh b'kedushas b'klisharis, so it's kedushas damin. Shmuel argued that when it is tahor, you can be podeh them. Rav Huna bar Manoach wants to argue that in order to understand why you cannot be podeh the wood, the frankincense, and the klei shares, to understand why you cannot be podeh them even though they supposedly were tameh, The way to understand that is to say that, well, even by the flour, when it is tahor, cannot be poded. And these three items, the wood, the frankincense, the klei shares, even though we're saying they became tamei, the fact of the matter is they are tahor. Either because the wood hasn't been shaped yet, or the frankincense has not yet been in the klei shares, or because the klei shares can go in the mikvah. So all these would be considered tahor, and that's why you cannot be poded them, because you cannot be poded tahor stuff. That is Rav Huna bar Manoach's argument. Lo, the Gemara answers no. You could still answer for Shmuel and say that tahor stuff could be poded. Le'olam emalach tahorin ba'alma niftin. Generally, you would be able to be poded the tahor stuff that's kedushas damim. Ve'ane mishum delo shchiche hu. And the reason why you can't be poded the wood and the frankincense and the klei shares are because they are uncommon and they are difficult to replace. It would be difficult to replace the klei shares. It would be difficult to replace the wood and the frankincense. Bishlam levana v'klei shares lo yishchicha. Okay, so I understand why I will say that the klei shares and the levana are hard to find. Okay, I don't know where they get the frankincense from. Maybe it's a hard item to find. The klei shares. Okay, fine. Ela eitzim, but I mean, there's wood all around. Go outside, find some wood. Mishka shchiche, are they not common? So you should be able to be poded them, right? Meaning we're saying that in general you can be poded the tahor stuff, and the only reason why you can't be poded these is because they are difficult to replace. So therefore, if you would just be poded them, right? If you would just be poded them, so then we wouldn't, right? So then we wouldn't be able to use them, right? We wouldn't, right? If you just poded the wood, we're not going to be able to use it anymore. You pod it. It's no longer for the Beis Hamikdash. So we say these items can't be poded because they're difficult to replace. But eitzim nami, and the answer is eitzim nami. Also, when it comes to wood, the truth is it's actually difficult to replace the amar mar, because we said kol eitz shenimtza bo tolas posel. We say in the Mishnah Midos that any wood that a worm is found in it is unusable. So legav mizbeach, for the mizbeach ilkach lo shchiche. Therefore, to find wood that has been checked and is usable for the mizbeach, that is not every single piece of wood, and therefore also it is a bit rare. It isn't super. It isn't as easy as just collecting wood. And therefore, look, in general, Shmuel would argue that tahor items can be poded. However, these items, the klei shares, the frankincense, the wood, because we want to keep them in the Beis Hamikdash, because they're difficult to replace, we say don't be poded them even when they are tahor. Givaldig. Okay, I'm going to drink a shtickle tea. Now says the Gemara, Amar Papa, says our Papa, Ishmiele l'Shmuel hadesanya. If Shmuel would have heard the following brayse, Amatbis tmimim lebedek habayis. Somebody who says, I'm donating an u to the base to the bedek habayis, the temple treasury. Now, us are roy lemizbeach as a korban. You can offer an u as a korban. So now, you can offer an u as a korban, so it's roy lemizbeach. However, he says that he wants to offer it to the bedek habayis. So it's come up before in the past. I don't remember exactly where. Probably it's vachim. That what happens if a person donates an animal that's roy lemizbeach to the bedek habayis? Do we can treat it like kedushas amizbeach or kedushas bedek habayis? Anyways, but over here, okay, he's saying he says that I'm donating an u to the bedek habayis. So what are we saying? So we're saying ein podin also, says the braysa, ein podin also ela lemizbeach. You can't just be podeh. You cannot simply be podeh. Even though it's kedushas, we're assuming that it's kedushas damim, monetary kedusha. And nonetheless, you can't just be podeh because it's roy lemizbeach. Ein podin oson ela lemizbeach. In order for you to be podeh, you would have to sell it to somebody who is looking to offer a korban. Okay? So if you say, I'm going to donate this ew to the bedek habayis, so you can't simply just be podeh and sell it to somebody. and give the money to Bedek Habayis. You'd have to sell it to somebody who's, so in the case of an somebody who needs to offer a shlamim or a chatas, it would have to be kept as a korban. You can't just be podeh it. Right? Matmis tmimim, right? And it's tamim. It's unblemished. It's healthy. Shekol haroy lamizbeach, because anything that's fit for the mizbeach, enu yotze midei mizbeach leolam, can never leave the mizbeach status. So it is. So let's skip to the end of the next line. Havahaderbe. If Shmuel, so Rav Papa says, if Shmuel would have known about this brisa that says that something that's right for the mizbeach, once ra'ui lamizbeach, always ra'ui lamizbeach, and even if you're going to be podeh, you'd have to sell it to somebody who's looking to offer a korban shlamim or a korban chatas with this So we see that you can't, right? We said it's a completely healthy korban, completely healthy animal, and we're saying you can't simply just be podeh it. So this would be a question on Shmuel, and if only says Rav Papa, if only Shmuel would have known about this brisa, he would have changed his mind and said tahor. Things that are fit for the mizbech that are tahor cannot simply be redeemed. Veloi, but says the Gemara, not necessarily. Shmuel knew about this brisa, velo adarbe, and yet he didn't change his opinion. Lav Omar Tosam came into lo shriche lo mi parke, because after all, did we not say just a few moments ago by the wood and the frankincense and the klei sharis that because they are difficult to replace, they are uncommon, or at least not super common, so therefore we don't redeem them. So here also, achanami came the shchiche mumin the pasle bebehemet afilu bedokin shebaayinami pasle, that since when it comes to an animal, it's actually not as straightforward as you think to have an animal that is roi lamizbeach. Even if it gets some kind of a film in its eye, that would be a mum that would prohibit it from being offered on the mizbeach. And therefore, just like we said with the wood and the frankincense and the klei sharis, also an animal that is perfectly healthy and has been donated to the Bedek Habayis, and we say, wait a second, this is a perfectly healthy animal, we want to keep it in the realm of the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore we say to sell it only to somebody who is looking to offer a korban with it. Hilkach lo shchiche, so therefore it's not common, right? A perfectly healthy animal is not as common as you think, and that's why we're saying we want you to keep it as a korban. However, Shmuel would argue something that is more common, something like flour, so that you would be able to be podeh even if it is tahor, if it's completely pure. Rav Kahana Omar Tmein Niftin Torin a Niftin. Rav Kahana says like Rav Huna that if they are tamei, right? So if the flour is tamei and it has not yet been in the klei sharis, of course, so it is, you can be podeh it if it's tamei Torin a Niftin, but you can't be podeh if it is tahor. Similarly says Rabbi Shaya Tmei and Niftin, only if it's tamei can the flour be podeh. Tahor and ein niftin, but not if it is tahor. There are those who say, however, that the Amar Rabbi Shaya agrees with Shmuel, afilu tahor and niftin, that even if they are tahor, you can be podeh, like Shmuel argues. Rabbi Lazar Amar says, Rabbi Lazar kulan tmein niftin tahor and niftin, by all menachos, only if they are tmein can they be podeh, but if they are tahor, they cannot be podeh. Chutz, the only exception being me'asir sa'efa shel minchas chote. The exception being the isaron of a minchas chote. Minchas chote, korban olav yored. Why is that? Why can you be podeh even if it is tahor? The answer is Sharei Amr Torah mechataso al chataso. Because in the context of korban olav yored, the pasuk says mechataso and al chataso, and we learn from that there are times if the person, for example, was wealthy and he had set aside money for to offer a kispa v'sira, and then his fortunes changed and now he's a poor man, so he can mechataso, he could be podeh the kispa v'sira, and then that if he had set aside, I guess, an animal already, so he'd be able to be podeh that animal, and then from mechataso, from that money, he could say, instead I'm going to bring a flour offering. And the same works the other way around, that the flour offering, if he had purchased flour for a flour offering, and then he became wealthy and he can afford now a kispa v'seira, a sheep or a goat, so then he will be podeh the flour, even though it's tahor, in order to be able to add on to al chatas, so to be able to add on to it and to bring the better chatas, to be able to bring the kispa v'seira. So therefore, in that case, with minchas chote, it can be poded even when it is tahor, according to Rabbi Elazar, but he would say other menachos, only if they are tamei can they be poded. Wow. That was quite the sugya. We are now going to move on. I just want to point out something from that last case of the mei chataso and al chataso. Just having another look at Rashi. Yes, when it comes to if he buys the flour for the flour offering, and then he gets wealthy, so he could be podeh that the flour in order to bring the kispa v'sira, the more expensive one. In terms of if he was wealthy and he set aside money for a kispa v'sira, definitely if he set aside money and then he became poor, he can use part of that money for the isaron. I don't yet know what if he had actually purchased an animal, a behema, and it was still healthy. All Rashi says is that if he had set aside money, I don't actually know right now what the halacha would be if he had actually used that money to buy an animal and the animal was healthy. Would he be able to be podeh that animal to then use part of the money for solas? I'll just say I don't see the answer in Rashi right now. Now we move on to Tumas ochalin for pigul of a mincha. Oh, okay. Specifically according to Reb Shimon. Sounds exciting. Amar Reb Oshai, says Reb Oshai Shamaiti, that I heard. Says Reb Oshai, I heard thus. Pigul b'mincha. I don't know, I'm going to assume it's talking about he took the komets and he burnt the komets on the mizbeach with the intention of eating the shirayim chutz lizmanu. Classic pigul. So the Reb Shimon, according to Reb Shimon, eino mitame tumas ochalin. Okay, so it's a shaila if this word is mitame or mitame. I was wondering this myself, so I opened up the Rambam. The Rambam, throughout this sugya in the Rambam, he is talking about mistamin, to contract tuma as opposed to convey tuma. But I learned this Gemara as the Rambam learns it, mitame, to become tame, tumas ochalin, as opposed to convey tumas ochalin, to transfer tumas ochalin. Before I sat down now to record, I had to look at the art scroll to confirm that this is how they learned it. And actually, apparently, first of all, they don't learn it this way. They learn it as mitame, to convey tuma. However, they do point out that there is such a machlokas. That being the case, I learned it to convey, to contract tuma. So that is how I am going to be explaining the sugya, just to point out that discrepancy. So eino mitame does not contract tumas ochalin. Okay, so says Reb Shimon, says Reb Oshai that according to Reb Shimon, pigul. So if you burn, let's say the komets with chutz lizmanu. So I assume therefore we're talking about the shirayim, that the shirayim you have to burn it. You have to burn it. And because you have to burn it, you can't get any enough from it, you just have to burn it, and it will not contract tumas ochalin. It's not the Tanya that we learn in a brayset. Ha'orla, when it comes to orla, fruit of a fruit tree in the first 3 years is asur ba'ano. The kilei karim is also asur ba'ano. V'shor aniskol, a ox that's been condemned to be stoned, if you slaughter it, it is also asur ba'ano. Ve'egla arufa, also an egla arufa that's been brought down to Nachal Eson, also is asur ba'ano. V'tzipori mitzora, the birds of a mitzora that we learned about in Chumash in last week's parsha, but also we've been talking about it quite a bit. If you slaughter them, asur ba'ano. Ufeter chamor, a firstborn donkey, would be asur ba'ano as well, so long as it hasn't been redeemed. Uvasur b'chalav, as well as meat and milk together, Also, we are saying kulam mitamin tumas ochlin. In all of these cases, according to Tanakama, they would be able to contract tumas ochlin, to become tamei with tumas ochlin. Reb Shimon always says, Reb Shimon kulan ein mitamin tumas ochlin. That Reb Shimon says that they cannot become tamei with tumas ochlin. Umoder Reb Shimon b'basar b'chalav. However, that from that list, Reb Shimon does, however, admit to one of those instances, basar b'chalav. In that case, it can contract tumas ochlin. Shemitami tumas ochlin can contract tumas ochlin. Ho'il v'oisa lo shas akosher. Since at one point it was kosher. What does that mean? So I think we're going to be learning, if I'm not mistaken, we're going to be learning about basar b'chalav in Masechta Chulin. All I'm going to point out right now is that the pasuk says, Lo sevasho gedi b'chalav imo. Don't cook meat and milk. If you take cold milk and put a chunk of meat in there, that would not be cooking it together. And therefore, so long as it hasn't been cooked, it wouldn't be lo sevasho gedi b'chalav imo. So that would be considered milk and meat, that at that point it is still kosher, right? As a shasa kosher. It's not yet, you haven't yet so you have meat and milk, but you're not yet in violation of lo sevasho gedi b'chalav imo. And because there was this shasa kosher, so therefore it can, because it had this point in which it was, at that point it was kosher, it can contract tumas ochlin. Okay. Fine. B'amar of Asi, says of Asi, Amar B'Yochanan, my taima de Reb Shimon. How come Reb Shimon says this? The answer is Mikola ochel asher ochel, because in the context of tumas ochlin, the pasuk says at the end of Parashat Shmini, I believe, ochel, right? Mikola ochel asher ochel, ochel she'ata yochol lachilo la'acherim kari ochel. That Reb Shimon would say only food that you can feed to others would be considered ochel that can contract tumah. Ochel she'i'ata yochol la'achilo la'acherim, but food that you would be unable to feed to others, eno kari ochel, would not be ochel, and therefore would not contract tumas ochlin. So all of those examples, like orla, kilei kerem, etc., all those examples on the list, they are asur ba'ana. You can't feed them to anybody else. You can't sell them to a nachri or anything like that. They're asur ba'ana, and because they're asur ba'ana, they don't contract tumas ochlin. Pigul, and when it comes to pigul b'mincha, and when it comes to when you burn the komets of a mincha with machshavas chutz lizmano, nami ochel she'at yochel achil lacherim, that shirayim, that the rest of the mincha, you have to burn it. You can't get any benefit from it. So hava and period. Who? Okay. So ochel she'at yochel achil lacherim who, and therefore Reb Oshaya says that Reb Shimon's opinion would be that pigul by a korban mincha, because the shirayim needs to be burnt, it would not contract tumas ochlin. Okay, if that's the case, basar b'chalav nami, if that's the case, that it's about being unable to feed to other people, about being asur ba'ana, why did Reb Shimon, why would the reason for Reb Shimon had said that when it comes to basar b'chalav, it can contract tumas ochlin? What was the reason? The reason is because it had a shasa kosher. Why don't we say that basar b'chalav can contract tumah because it's mutar ba'ana, according to Reb Shimon? Basar b'chalav nami tepukle de ochel she'ata yochel achil la'acherimu. That Reb Shimon would say that basar b'chalav is mutar ba'ana, so that's why it should be able to contract tumas ochlin. The sign that we learn about Reb Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Reb Shimon, basar b'chalav asur b'achilu mutar ba'ana. That basar b'chalav is asur, you can't eat it, but you can get benefit from it. You can sell it to a nachri. Shenemar ki am Kodesh ato la'Hashem Elokecha l'svasho gedi b'chalav imo. By basar b'chalav it says ki am Kodesh ato la'Hashem Elokecha, and by treifa it says ulalinu va'anshe Kodesh tiunu v'asar basar de treifa lo sochelu. Malahalan asur b'achilu mutar ba'ana, just like by treif where it talks about how holy we are, and it is also b'achila b'mutar ba'ana. So afkan also by basar b'chalav where it talks about how holy we are, also b'achila b'mutar ba'ana, it's also to eat it, and it is mutar ba'ano. It's also to eat basar b'chalav, but it is mutter ba'ano. So let's say that the reason why it can contract tumas ochalin basar b'chalav, according to Reb Shimon, is because it is mutter ba'ano. Interestingly, all these things about, right, it says I'm Kodesh. Interestingly, it's a pattern I've noticed is that specifically in the context of food, it talks about holiness, right? We saw also by eating treifas, and also in Parsha Shmini, it talked about all the foods that you can eat, and then all foods you can't eat, what's tar, what's tummy, what's kosher, what's not, and then it says v'skadosh tem v'yisem kadoshim. Anyways, very interesting. Also, this week's Parsha, right, talks about eating blood, right, not eating blood specifically. It's very interesting. Anyways, fine. So, kan also b'achila umuter b'ano. Fine. Now, chadav od kamar, you're right. Reb Shimon, the reason for Reb Shimon saying that basar b'chalav can contract tumas ochalin can be because it is muter b'ano. That's correct. Chada v'od kamar is saying this and also that. Chada the ochal shat yochol lachil achem. Reason number one for why basar b'chalav can contract tumas ochalin is because it is muter b'ano. It's something that you can feed to others. V'od, and also the didei nami haislo shasa kosher, that even for Yidden it had a shasa kosher at one point. It was not, right, when it was cold and it hadn't yet been cooked, it was not yet a violation of lo sefashel gedi b'chalav imo. So there are in fact two reasons why you can explain that Reb Shimon would say that the basar b'chalav can contract tumas ochalin meisvei. However, we have a contradiction to Reb Oshaya. Reb Oshaya had said that pigul for a korban mincha, Reb Shimon would say, cannot contract tumas ochalin because it's also ba'ano. However, Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, yesh noser shu mitame tumas ochalin. There is noser that can contract tumas ochalin. V'yesh noser she'eno mitame tumas ochalin, that cannot contract tumas ochalin. Kate said also, lon lifnei zrika eno mitame tumas ochalin. Well, what if, for example, you have a korban and it was slaughtered, and the dam was never zrikad. You never did zrikas adam, and then it stayed off of the mizbeach overnight. So it never had a shas heter lakohanim. There was never zrikas adam. It was never permitted, and therefore there will not be tumas ochalin. La'achar zrika mitami tumas ochalin. But after zrikas adam, when there was a shas kosher, it was shas heter lakohanim. So then, even if by the next day, let's say it's a korban chatas, by the next day it becomes noser, it will be able to contract tumas ochalin. Ufigul, and when it comes to pigul, bein bekachim kachim, bein bekachim kalim. Whether we're talking about, let's say, he did zrikas adam with the intention of eating chutz lizmano, whether we're talking about kachim, like a chatas, or kachim kalim, like a shlomim, eino mitami tumas ochalin, there will be no tumas ochalin. However, pigel bemincha, mitami tumas ochalin, but pigul by a mincha there is tumas ochalin, which goes in the face of what Reb Oshaya was saying. That Reb Oshaya wanted to say that according to Reb Shimon, pigul by a mincha there would be no tumas ochalin. Here, the Reb Shimon is saying explicitly, pigul by mincha mitame tumas ochalin. There is tumas ochalin. Lo kasha, no problem. Kancha oiselo shasa kosher, kancha lo oiselo shasa kosher. It depends if there was a shasa kosher for this grain or not. What would be where there was no shasa kosher? Well, if he was makdish the grain while it was still connected to the ground already, so already from the time it was harvested, you already makdish it to be a mincha. Okay, but why not just be podeh? Unlach lishna de Omar Rebushaya Tmain Niftin Torin a Niftin. Shapir now Rebushaya and Daf Kuf Aleph Amud Bey Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph. Rebushaya had two opinions there about whether tahor flour can be poded. The first opinion was no. The first opinion was that only tameh flour can be poded. Of course, Klisharis. Only tameh flour can be poded, tahor flour cannot be poded. So according to that version, okay, I can explain that the flour, it was you were makdish it already when it was still growing in the ground, and because it's tahor, you can't be poded. So it never had a shasa kosher, and therefore it cannot become tamid tumas ochlin. But according to the version of Rabbi Shaya that he agrees with Shmuel that when it's tahor you can be poded lifarkinu. So why not just be poded, and it should be considered like it has a shasa kosher, and it should be able to be tamid tumas ochlin. So so even if you were makdish it when it was still connected to the ground, it should be able to become tamid tumas ochlin because you can redeem it. Ash demia lo park. To which the Gemara answers, yeah, but right now at this point, the fact of the matter is he wasn't poded, and therefore it's considered like it never had a shasa kosher, and it would be unable to be tamid tumas ochlin. However, when the Brisa says that the pigul of mincha can become tamid tumas ochlin, it's talking about when he was makdish it later on after it was harvested. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Aleph of Masechta Menachos. All right, friends. On Daf Kuf Aleph, Daf 101 of Masechta Menachos, Shish, we learned a lot. On the first part of the Daf, we were talking about being podeh Kodesh. Shish. Okay, I broke this stuff down. Hopefully I broke it down well enough. So, you can always be podeh Kedushas Bedek Habayis. Okay, that we didn't talk about that today, but I think it's important in this context, and hopefully I understand that correctly, that if I donate my watch, if I makdish my watch to the Beis HaMikdash, I could be podeh it, whenever I want. Now, things that are fit for the Mizbeach, however, so this is where it gets more detailed. So now, if it's Kedushas HaGuf, Kedushas HaGuf cannot be podeh unless it is an animal with a mum. Okay, so if Sarah the ewe has been chosen to be a korban chatas that now has kedushas aguf, and it gets a mum, you can be poded. Other could do it, but for example, a bird that has kedushas aguf, you can't be poded. Now, once it is kados in a klishares, you can't be poded. No poded. Once it's kados in a klishares, that's right. Whether we're talking about flour, whether we're talking about an animal that's been shechted, once we're talking about a klishares, you cannot be poded. Now, if you have, for example, flour that is pre-kli shares, so it's kedushas damim, so kedushas damim that is tamei, you can be poded. Now, when it comes to kedushas tamim that is tahor, we saw it's machlokas. Shmuel says you can be poded, and Rav Huna bar Menach says you cannot be poded, and we saw other Amoraim who agree who kind of take sides. Sheesh. Now, Tumas ochlin for pigul of a mincha, according to Rab Shimon, says Rab Oshaya that according to Rab Shimon, it cannot contract tuma because it must be burnt. And when it comes to pigul of a korban mincha, so therefore there will not be tumas ochlin because it's also banoah and it must be burnt. Although we did say that if it had a shasa kosher, right? So if you were makdish it after it had already been harvested, so then it would be able to contract tumas ochlin. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Aleph, Daf 101 of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day and Yom Chag Sameach. Cheers.